This video is on learning targets 16 through 20, amphibians and reptiles. Amphibians live their adult life on land, but as larvae, they are on water, so that's where they get their name. Amphibians, both land and water. They're able to breathe through lungs as an adult, but some of them still retain the gills from when they were young. You can see here on this particular uh, salamander, it's called a mud puppy, has the gills there. You can see them. They're external gills. They also have moist skin, which allows them to take in oxygen and get rid of CO2 through their skin. Amphibians have evolved from ancient fish, and amphibians needed to do two things in order to come out of the water. They needed to be able to breathe air through lungs, and they needed to be able to support the weight of their head and their upper body, essentially be able to get their head out of the mud with strong forelimbs, as you see here. And so this allowed them to walk, and this is where we have the formation of what's called a pelvic girdle, which is basically your shoulder and your collarbone and your forearms or your forelimbs. Amphibians have these particular adaptations for land. As we mentioned, we have mentioned lungs. We mentioned their limbs. They must be strong enough to move their weight around. And many amphibians obviously have four limbs and not just two. And their skin is able to secrete mucus through mucous membranes to keep their skin nice and moist so that they're able to breathe. This particular frog lives in the desert and it burrows into the ground during the rain, and it's able to lay eggs and deal with that harsh environment in that way. As far as feeding is concerned, amphibians live as herbivores that eat only plants as larvae, but as adults, many of them are carnivores. They have long tongues to catch prey, as seen in this picture. Frogs and salamanders have that. Their digestive systems are compartmentalized, meaning that they have special compartments like a stomach, intestines, very similar things to what you think of when you think of a digestive system. There's also specialized organs that aid in that digestion of food that aren't necessarily part of that compartmentalization. Circulation says a double loop circulation, meaning that the blood goes from the heart to the lungs in order to get oxygen and then back out to the body and back to the heart. And so it's the first circulation system that we've seen of this kind. There is some mixing of the blood, as you see in this picture, and because it's a three-chambered heart, not four, and in later circulation systems that will be taken care of. In respiration for amphibians, in larvae, gas exchange through the skin and through the gills, but where adults have lungs, but they also can do that through their skin, as we've mentioned. As far as reproduction for amphibians have external fertilization in most, and their eggs must be in water at all times. They cannot be away from water. And you can see here, basically the male frog is squeezing the eggs out of the female, and then he will fertilize them. Amphibian movement. Amphibians have lots of specialized movement, different kinds of movement. Larvae are mostly swimmers because they're born in the water and they live there until they become adults. And many adults, like I said, have specialized movements like these frogs. They're able to jump long distances. As far as response, amphibians have specialized structures, including the tympanic membrane, which is essentially a primitive eardrum. They have membranes over their eyes to protect their eyes because they don't have eyelids. And some amphibians have lateral line systems very similar to what we see in fish. I didn't mention excretion. Excretion for amphibians, they have filters or kidneys that filter waste, and urine is created from urea. And this is This urea is a chemical that is used to remove nitrogenous wastes from the blood. Now, three main groups of amphibians. First is salamanders. These have four legs. They live in streams. Here's a tiger salamander, so, native to this area of the country. Frogs and toads. These have the ability to jump. Frogs, the difference is frogs are tied to water, whereas toads can be found in many more places, can be in the water, but are mostly found on land, though both of them still have to lay their eggs in water. And these are called caecilians, and caecilians are legless amphibians. They burrow in sediment. Some of them have scales, very similar to fish, not like amphibian or not like reptiles. But these are um, the oddest group of amphibians. All right, for reptiles, reptiles are dry, so they don't need to be in the water. They have scaly skin, and they have an amniotic egg, which allows them to separate themselves from the water. They are able to live their entire lives, back here, they're able to live their entire lives outside of the water, so they don't need water, even though some amphibians do live in the water. Their skin is a protective layer against water loss, and their skin actually doesn't grow, so they have to shed their skin as they grow. As far as the evolution of reptiles, reptiles share a common ancestry with amphibians. They were the first vertebrates that were not dependent on water. Dinosaurs represent the most successful group of reptiles, and they went from everything small as a chicken to as big as, you know, it's just as big as a school bus times five. And they ran on two or four legs. Some of them may have even had feathers. And reptiles, again, or dinosaurs again, represent the most successful time for reptiles, and many of them were lost by what is called mass extinction, which is just the extinction of a large group of organisms, and this made room for the current species that kind of rules the world, and that is mammals. But reptiles are still around and still do really well. Reptiles are called ectotherms because they have to control their body temperature through external means, hence ecto is external. They have to sun themselves in order to warm up, and they have to find someplace cool in order to cool down. And so their behavior can directly affect their body temperature. Reptiles are able to feed a wide range of things. Here's a crocodile dining on a wildebeest. Usually carnivores, but reptiles are able to feed on a number of different things. As far as respiration, reptiles have a spongy lung, which creates more surface area. They have a muscular chest, which allows for the movement of air into and out of the body. They have a double loop circulation system, very similar to amphibians. Excretion, they produce, or some of them produce urine, and some reptiles actually have a bladder, like a urinary bladder, the first of its kind as far as evolution is concerned. And some reptiles are able to convert ammonia to solid waste called uric acid in order to conserve water. And this is a trait that they share with birds. As far as response for reptiles, very similar to amphibians, a more developed cerebrum, so they have more thinking. They're active during the day, and many of them have eyes that see in color. Snakes have a very good sense of smell, and for many reptiles, their tongue represents one of their strongest sensory organs, in that they can sense chemicals simply by flicking their tongue. It's almost like a sense of smell in a way. And some snakes can even detect body heat. with pits on the side of their faces. They're called pit vipers, like cottonmouths and copperheads. Rattlesnakes are very common pit vipers in this part of the world. So they're able to see a mouse without actually seeing it. Movement, strong limbs, and they're able to hold their weight up off the ground, and they also have rotated shoulders, which brings them more to the front, and very similar to what we see as far as mammals are concerned, especially with many reptiles that are more closely related to mammals. Reproduction for reptiles: internal fertilization and oviparous, meaning that they lay eggs. The embryo is covered with a leathery type shell, not like an egg shell like we think of a chicken egg, but more of like a leathery shell, but it is able to be laid outside of the water. And so that is called an amniotic egg, an egg that can survive on the land because of this protective shell. And reptiles typically lay their eggs and run off and leave them to fend for themselves. 4 orders of reptiles: lizards and snakes is the first order, are a group with highly specialized senses, as we mentioned with snakes earlier. Lizards also have highly developed senses, and some lizards are able to, sense even color or surroundings. There's crocodilians, and these are the oldest order. Long snouts, as you can see here, they're able to catch prey. Many carnivorous, and they watch over their young as hatchlings, which separates them from the rest of reptiles. Uh, Turtles and tortoises. Turtles are in the water, tortoises are on land. Mostly we think of turtles as the kind that we see near the water, but there are tortoises around here as well. These have a protective shell, and the shell is not something they can come out of, contrary to a popular kids cartoon, but the shell is actually part of their skeleton. And lastly, the 4th order of reptiles is called a tuatara, and they resemble lizard, very primitive scales, and they actually have what's called a third eye on the top of their head and the top of their brain, and it's a specialized sensory organ that is able to detect heat.